The transition we are talking about here today is the transition from high school life to whatever is going to come after for folks with disabilities. In today's agenda, what we're going to do is I'm first just going to do that real background on what is transition, go into legal rights, and then hand you over to Ms. Butler for how we can get good transition services, how you can get help with transition, and then of course, if we have time, questions. So just jumping into it, what is transition? So transition, as we're talking about it today, are the supports and services available to teenagers and young adults with disabilities to support them as they successfully move from our high school education system to whatever is going to be their goals and their life after that time period. As a lawyer, I always jump to the law stuff first, but I think it's important also for us to think about how broad this can be. So when we're talking about transition, a lot of times people focus only on things like employment readiness or getting a high school degree, things like that. But it can include everything from life skills to college readiness, assistive technology, internships, and those employment readiness skills. So I tried to get around it, but I got to tell you the law, because the law is the reason that not only is transition a great thing, but it's something that actually has to be there for our kids with disabilities and has to be offered. So where that is in the law, it's actually in federal law, and it's in federal law in two places. The first one is in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as the IDEA. For anyone who doesn't know what the IDEA is what a lot of us refer to as special education in public or charter schools, okay? And the IDEA, the easy way to remember it is two of those letters are I in E. So if you think IEP, IDEA, IEP. So the IDEA applies to students who have IEPs or should have IEPs. The other one, and this is a bit of a mouthful, is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that people just call the Rehab Act. And it, as was amended by the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014, or WIOA, as people will refer to it. Basically, what this is, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is very much a civil rights act for people with disabilities. Nice and simple. And the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014 really added to the substance of it to make sure that we are not only just making sure people don't get discriminated against, but making sure that people with disabilities actually have the opportunity to be successful, integrated members of their community in the workforce. Okay, so I know there are a lot of words on these slides, and so I have also given a copy of this in PDF form to Bambi that can be sent around. If folks would like the full copy of it, there are legal sites and things on it as well. But basically, under the IDEA, so for those IEP kids, transition services are a coordinated set of activities designed within a results-oriented process that's focused on improving academic and functional achievement of the child with the disability to facilitate their movement to from school to post-school activities. Most important here is it's supposed to be based on the individual child's needs, taking into account their strengths, preferences, and interests. Okay, so this is not a one size fits all. Those plans are supposed to be really tailored to that student and what they need and want with their life. And Ms. Glyn will go into how you do that in a little bit. Also, make sure it isn't, even though this is within the school system. So IDEA, IEP means done by the school, basically, in the school system. But it isn't just instruction. It can be related services, which could be anything from PT, OT, counseling, whatever that might be. It can be community experiences. It is developing employment and other post-school living objectives, and if appropriate, daily living skills and provision of functional vocational evaluation. So that's kind of the school end of things. And just to remember, transition has to be part of a student's IEP starting on the first IEP, where they will be 16 years old, and then updated annually thereafter. And that it must include measurable post-secondary goals based upon age-appropriate transition assessments, and it has to include all the services that are needed to assist the child in getting to those goals. Okay, so that's the school part out of the way. Those are the obligations of the school. The other half of this are the obligations under what's called WIOA, or the Rehab Act. And these are typically done by vocational rehab services or the state in some way. And so transition services under WIOA sound a whole lot similar to those ones under the IDEA. They're designed with an outcome-oriented process. They include all competitive integrated employment, supportive employment, continuing ed, adult services, independent living services, community participation. And again, they're supposed to take into account the student's needs and interests and preferences. And has, all of those things kind of put together into a plan. And this is where it's going to get even more confusing, because it has a very similar name to the IDEA one. This one's actually called an IPE. You mix the letters the other way around. But if you just think about it as the school stuff and the vocational rehab stuff, hopefully it can kind of stay a little separate. But what it's really supposed to do is have a plan that promotes and facilitates that achievement, and that is supposed to really engage the student in doing that. The other thing that's neat about WIOA is, so yes, it covers students with a disability who are 16 to 21 and have an IEP or a 504 plan for the most part. But it also covers what are called youth with disabilities, who are between 14 and 24 years old. And so this expands it a little so that we're not just limited to folks who are still in school. As we know, a lot of students with disabilities do end up either dropping out or ending up in the criminal justice system, or ending up in all different sorts of situations where they may be coming back to these services after school. And so that fits within youth with a disability. Also, these do not need to be disabilities where you have to have an IEP plan or a 504 plan. They use the definition of disability within their own stuff, but it's basically a mental or physical condition or behavioral condition or diagnosis that impacts someone's life activities, and especially as relates to your work. So what I'm going to do now is hand you over to Ms. Butler for the nuts and bolts of how do you get good transition services? How do you move past that one size fits all plan to something that's gonna have that great outcome in the end?
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to get started by, kind of like giving you the most important parts of how to get the transition services through your IEP. The first thing is transition should be discussed starting no later than the first IEP, where the student will be 16 years of age. That's extremely important to remember because sometimes that does not always happen. So, as a parent or guardian, you do have that right to make sure that that discussion does occur at that time when that student turns 16 years old. The next is the school district, with parental consent, must invite outside agencies to these IEPs to discuss transition. This is very important because I know sometimes it might seem like, oh, well, what is the need for this? It's still early. We don't need to do all of this now. But it is very important because sometimes there are some agencies out there that a student may actually benefit from receiving services through. And the problem is that those agencies may have their own rules to where there might be some timelines or even a waiting list. An example of that would be OCDD. OCDD, a lot of times, they provide a lot of services, but sometimes there are some timelines involved, as well as even just, maybe even a waiting list. So the sooner, if you know that student is going to need those services, the sooner you bring them to the table, the sooner you can actually get that process started, even if it just means completing paperwork that may need to be completed. You may not be able to get those services right then because of maybe the timelines involved, but it actually helps to get that process started. So when by the time that student is getting ready to exit, all of that has already been worked out pretty much. The next is the transition plan should be individualized and based on transition assessments. This is also very important. This is important because the transition plan needs to be tailored to that particular student. There are no two transition plans that are ever going to look the same. I don't care if you're dealing with siblings, they're never going to be exactly the same. Each person's transition plan is going to be individualized, and if it's not, it should be. And the next thing is the transition page of the IEP is incredibly important, even if the student may not graduate for 2 to 6 years. That's very important because sometimes, I know a lot of times when there are IEP meetings, there may be other issues that are going on, and there are times when school districts are kind of like wanting to just glaze over the transition plan and not really focus a lot on it. And that should not be happening because that plan is extremely important. The transition page is pretty much going to be it's pretty much the main part of the document that's going to help to guide that student from what they're going to need while they're in school, as well as to what they're going to need once they're exiting high school. So this is going to be very important to make sure that the transition part of the IEP is reviewed. And Debbie, I think your screen took the pictures off. I mean, took the presentation off.
Um, 1 second, please. I'm sorry. I'm having some technical difficulties. Share screen. Please excuse. Okay. Let's see if I can get this to work.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yes, I can see it. So as I was saying, that's why it's very important to make sure that the transition page of an IEP is thoroughly reviewed. Um, And a lot of times, I realize that, when you're in an IEP meeting, there may be some other issues. But it's very important to take the time and actually have a really good, candid discussion about the transition page of the IEP. And the transition page of the IEP is gonna change. It's never gonna remain the same. It may change in 6 months, it may change in a year, it may change in a year and a half. It just really depends on that student and what that student's needs are and what that student's interests are. So just remember that it's not a document where there's just one size fits all. It has to be tailored to that individual student and what their interests and needs are. So we've actually included a sample of the transition page on within an IEP. And so basically, if you look at it, you can tell there's a lot of information that needs to be included on there. But one of the most important thing to remember is when you start getting to the section that talks about the goals, it's very important to really elaborate and go into details about what that student desires are. What's the interest? What is that student's goal? And you want to make sure that whatever is documented, that is really going to be realistic. Because a lot of times I've found where transition plan, things are just written on there, and you're like, well, there's just no way that this student is going to be able to do this.
So Glyn, how many times have you had people's goal to be, let's see, professional football players, rock stars, supermodels?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And so the thing is, a lot of times I find where the schools, they know that these are not realistic goals. And so what needs to happen is there just needs to be more of a detailed discussion with the student to try to figure out, okay, so you may want to be a professional football player, but what if you couldn't be a professional football player? What would you want to do? Would you want to be able to work someplace that focuses on sports and try to elicit a more realistic goal out of that student rather than just putting them there, oh, student wants to play football. So it's very important to remember that when you're doing the transition page, you want it to be very realistic, because you got to remember, this is going to be that page that's going to help guide that student from high school all the way up to like exiting from high school. So you want to make sure everything that's documented on there is going to be extremely realistic. This is a perfect time to actually, even like I said before, bring in those agencies that can be of benefit to that student. And that includes VR. And so the thing is, just remember, in order for the schools to invite anyone, they have to have the parental consent. And also, too, if there are some agencies that you feel the school may not be wanting to invite, as a parent or guardian, you have a right to request that the school system actually invites those individuals. And so, and the thing is, that's also important to remember too, is that if for some reason they tell you no, you have a right to let them know that you know what the law states. And the thing is, don't ever just accept the fact of them saying, oh, well, we'll just do it later. No, the transition page should actually be done immediately once that student is turning age 16. That should be, there should be another IEP meeting held and a discussion in regards to those transition services.
Hey, Glenn, what do you do if you happen to hear from a school, oh, we don't really focus on that till the year people graduate? Because I don't know about you, but I feel like I've heard that a couple times.
Yes. For me, what I do is I would always tell parents or guardians, if you're not sure whether or not that's accurate, you can contact our office and we can actually provide assistance with that by attending meetings with you and making sure that the appropriate agency, and I'm talking about VR, is actually invited, because that's totally untrue to say that to a parent. And the main thing is, in order for VR to be able to attend the IEP meeting, they just need timely notice. So it's not good enough for a school district to sit there and actually send a notice the morning of a meeting, say, oh, hey, can you attend this meeting? And we've even gotten notices like that. No, if they provide them with enough timely notice for the meetings, they will make every effort to attend the meeting, and they can do it in person. They might do it virtually. They may do it by phone, but they will make every effort to be able to attend a meeting as long as they have that timely notice of a meeting. So it's really important to make sure that they're going to have the advance notice. The other thing too to remember about that is, it's a good idea, even when the schools are sending out the 10-day prior notice letters, to actually include the agencies that are being invited, and that includes VR, because in that way, that'll give them some time to arrange their schedules so they can be in attendance. Of course, VR can't attend every meeting that's held, but they will make an effort to attend some of the meetings when they're invited to be there. There are some schools where I do know where the person, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but where the counselors that are assigned to the schools, they make a day of it. They have that kind of rapport with whomever the folder holder is for the IEPs, to where they might have 5 meetings that one day, and that seems to work out well, because then they can just take that whole day and just block it off for attending IEP meetings and talking about the transition plan and that sort of thing. um the In regards to VR, I kind of thought it would be important to kind of give everybody just a kind of better idea of exactly what VR and who they are, because a lot of individuals actually do not know who VR is. So basically, VR is designed to help job seekers with disabilities access employment, education, training, and support services to succeed in the labor market and to match employment with the skilled workers they need to compete with in the global economy. In Louisiana, the main VR agency is Louisiana Rehabilitation Services. There are 8 regional LRS offices throughout the state. So, depending on what region you reside in, that would be the agency that you would actually contact for services. So, prime example, if someone lived here in Baton Rouge, there is actually a VR agency that's located here in Baton Rouge. So that person would actually go through the office here. And so what we also did was included some basic information about LRS by including their website information. So if there's some additional information anyone wants to look up, they can go into the website and look it up. And there is a lot of really good information there. Um, the next thing is VR and transition students. Vocational rehab counselors are assigned to schools within their region in order to provide, as you remember, I said that, there are counselors that actually are assigned to the schools depending on the region that they're actually in. Not all VR counselors are going to have a transition caseload. It just depends. But if they do have a transition caseload, then basically these counselors are going to be assigned to a number of schools. And those would be the schools that they're going to be responsible for going in to provide the transition services. And so basically the services that they're going to provide is going to be pre-employment transition services, outreach information, consultation to students and families, technical assistance to schools, participation in IEP meetings, participation in planning and coordination of services, and establishing eligibility for the VR program. And that tends to come into play when the student is actually getting ready to exit. That's where VR actually comes in terms in regards to helping that student become eligible for just the regular traditional VR services. So transition services available through VR. VR provides a coordinated set of services designed within an outcome-oriented process, promoting movement from school to post-school activities, including pre-employment transition services, post-secondary education, vocational training, competitive integrated employment, and that includes supported employment, continuing in adult education, and if appropriate, referral to continuing and adult education services and adult services, independent living, or community participation. So this is it's very important to kind of have this information because this is basically all of the services that all of the transition services that VR can actually provide to students. Okay, so now we're going to get into the pre-employment transition services, or as we call it, PRE-ETS. Vocational rehabilitation must set aside 15% of its federal allotment for pre-employment transition services, which is known as PRE-ETS, for students with disabilities between the ages of 16 and 21. This is not something that VR has an option of doing. They have to set aside the 15% every year. It's a federal allotment that's required. Now, I will say this, and I know it says from ages 16 and 20 to 21. However, if a student turns 22 during the school year, the school system isn't going to tell that student they can't return to school. That student will be allowed to complete that school year. And so that student would still receive those pre-employment transition services. PRE-ETS could you go back a little bit? Okay, so PRE-ETS is the coordinated activities for a student with a disability designed within an outcome-oriented process that promotes movement from school to post-school activities, leading to competitive integrated employment. Okay, next. Okay, so there are three ways in which PRE-ETS can be provided to students with disabilities. The LRS counselor can provide the services directly in schools or virtually. It can be done through a community rehabilitation program, or it can be done through a third party arrangement between LRS and the school district. And you tend to see a lot of the third party arrangements. And I think this works pretty well because a lot of times there's school districts that just really do not want LRS coming in. And so doing these third party arrangements allows the school district to pretty much hire who they want to hire to actually come in and provide the transition, the transition services to the students. Okay, so the pre-employment transition service activities. There are 5 elements that are covered by PRE-ETS. The first is going to be job exploration counseling. And that's basically where the student could be doing some research. There's going to be maybe a discussion about the labor market in regards to maybe a field that the student may be interested in going into. That's where the interest inventories come into play. There's going to be the discussion about the interest inventories. It's going to be basically looking at whatever fields that person may be interested in going into. It just kind of helping them to get a better understanding and more knowledge about what that may even entail. The next is going to be work-based learning experiences. And in work-based learning experiences, this is where work can be paid or it can be unpaid. It can involve like volunteering, or it can involve internships. So it's basically where the students have that opportunity to actually obtain employment, and or even if they're not working to be paid, they're still getting those experiences. And the next is counseling on opportunities for enrollment in comprehensive transition or post-secondary educational programs at institutions of higher education. This is where the counselors can actually sit there. Let's just say if there's a student who is interested in going to college, they can help them find out information about the schools. If the student needs help in completed their FAFSA applications, the counselors can actually even provide assistance in doing that. The next is workplace readiness training to develop social skills and independent living. This is very important because this is where the students can learn interviewing skills. They can learn financial literacy information. It's going to be information dealing with that. They're also going to learn how to understand the importance about the needs, the importance of what an employee will need, or employer will need or is looking for in an employee. And then they're going to learn information about the importance of being punctual for a job. So all of those things can fall under the workplace readiness training. And the last is going to be instruction and self-advocacy, which may include peer mentoring. This is going to be where students are going to be taught how if they may need some accommodations, how to actually ask that, if they have questions, or if there's some type of maybe conflict they're having, how to try and go about to get that resolved, and even to help them to better um, be able to go into their own IEP meetings and advocate for what they feel they may actually want. Okay, next. Okay. So, getting transition services through VR, regardless of whether or not a student with a disability has an IEP, they can receive transition assistance through vocational rehabilitation services. This includes students with 504 plans and students without plans. Regardless of whether or not a youth with a disability is in school, they can receive transition assistance through vocational rehabilitation services. So it's important to understand and realize that these transition services must be applied for directly through vocational rehabilitation, and the student's parent or guardian, or even a youth, depending on how old that person is. The one thing that they would have to do is actually provide information verifying that they actually do have a disability, and so that will a documented disability, and that can, actually be obtained from a doctor. So that's the information that would have to be provided to LRS, but the person would also, as stated, would have to actually apply for the services. And one of the things that I always like to make sure an individual just understands in general about LRS is that having a disability does not automatically entitle an individual to LRS services. And the person must go through the application process. And that's really important to understand about LRS, especially for individuals who are just trying to just get regular traditional services through LRS. There's no automatic entitlement to those services. You have to be deemed eligible, and part of that is going through the application process. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you how Disability Rights Louisiana can assist with employment and transition needs. Disability Rights Louisiana houses Louisiana's Client Assistance Program, or as we call it, CAP. And CAP's mission statement basically states and is to help maximize employment and independence opportunities for people with disabilities by providing advocacy, information, and advice to individuals who apply for or receive services from vocational rehabilitation and independent living programs. Through the CAP program, Disability Rights Louisiana provides the following information and referral services. Information about services and benefits available under the Rehabilitation Act, including transition, how to access employment related services, including transition, and referral to other resources. So a lot of times individuals might contact us, but they don't really want our actual assistance, but they might just want some basic information. So we can, actually just give them some referral sources in regards to who they can contact to get the information they may be looking for. But this is where it's very important for people to understand that if they're having transition issues with the schools, they can actually contact our office for that assistance. And I do realize that, Families Helping Families does do a lot of the transition stuff, but of course, they're limited in what they can actually do. But we're just another resource out there. And so we like to let people know that, hey, if you're having transition issues and you're needing some assistance, this is the time, and then feel free to contact us, because we would be able to actually go in and provide assistance to making sure that that student is receiving those transition services. Okay. Okay, in regards to individual case advocacy, through the CAP program, Disability Rights Louisiana provides advocacy for individuals on issues related to VR, transition, and other employment related issues. CAP attempts to resolve disputes using the least formal means possible. And advocacy can include providing advice and interpretation of law and guidance, negotiation with agencies such as VR in schools, mediation with agencies such as VR, representation at administrative reviews, representation at formal appeal um, procedures, such as fair hearings and representation in judicial actions. Now, one of the things I do want to say is that whenever it starts to get more to the judicial actions, that's going to be more of where, because of course, I, as a CAP advocate, cannot go into district court or federal court and represent anyone. That is where, when it gets to that point, I would actually turn everything over to my supervisor, who is an attorney, and she would review everything and determine whether or not it is something that we would take a judicial action on. I also like to make sure that clients always understand that sometimes there might be issues that they're wanting to raise where it may not be an issue where, after CAP has done its investigation, warrants taking the actions that the individual may want to pursue. And so that's why it's so important. And the main thing that CAP does whenever we get cases is to actually do an investigation first, to make sure that there is actually merit. And we do that by, making contact with LRS once we've gotten releases signed, and we request the relevant records.
And I know for me, something that has been really eye-opening since I've been working with the program is how often just having the CAP advocate help interpret, basically, and I don't mean this as in sign language or other language interpretation, but basically be a conduit for information between LRS and the client, because a lot of times we see misunderstandings and things like that that have gotten to the point people are coming to us, but that can be relatively easily fixed by getting everybody on the same page.
Yes.
And so I love that we always kind of try that first before jumping to the more and more formal means.
Exactly, because sometimes it could be something just as simple as um a document that a person didn't understand that they needed to submit, or they just haven't submitted yet. It can be, a lot of times it's just very simple things, or it could be just something where there's an issue with the communication. And so a lot of times you can actually quickly and very easily go in and get that fixed and work out, because sometimes it is situations where it's just a matter of maybe just coming up with a time that that client is going to actually be available to be able to communicate with that counselor. And so it's just basic, just simple little things like that. And it's sometimes it does take just thinking outside of the box. Or it could be something like the a client may be required to maybe attend an appointment, and they just haven't actually scheduled that appointment. It's just a matter of me coming in and just explaining why they have to attend that appointment, and even providing assistance in making sure that they're scheduling the appointment on a at a date and time that works for them.
And on that, I know that you even, sometimes we're able to see the barriers people don't think of. The client says, well, I don't want to go to the appointment, and LRS says, we can't help you unless you go to the appointment. Well, after a little digging, and because especially Miss Butler has been doing this for such a long time, she'll get to the crux of, oh, the real concern is the person can't afford it or can't go on a Tuesday because they don't have childcare or whatever it may be, and is able to find those creative solutions where, maybe you find a doctor, they can find a doctor who is available on a day the person's available, or they're able to provide transportation to get there for free or whatever it may be.
Exactly, because a lot of times the client does not think to actually share just those tiny bits of information with the counselor. And so if it's not shared with the counselor isn't going to know that. And so sometimes the counselor may just perceive that as, well, they're just not wanting to do what needs to be done. But that's not necessarily the case. It's just that there's always going to be a reasoning behind it. It's just, it just may take some time to get that person to actually open up and state, what that reasoning is. I remember I had one individual that just didn't like having appointments on Thursdays and Fridays. But the individual never actually shared that with her counselor. But then after talking with the individual and then, us having a meeting, that's when she opened up about that. And so we were immediately able to actually work that out. And within that next week, the person had scheduled an appointment on a date that worked for her. Okay, so through the CAP program, Disability Rights Louisiana provides advocacy on individual issues, on indi-
You already did that one. You're on
oh, I did.
systems
Oh,
now. That was
sorry
my
about
fault. Please excuse the technical difficulties on my end. I appreciate your patience.
that.
This is
Okay.
Deborah.
In regards to CAP and systems advocacy, through the CAP program, Disability Rights Louisiana addresses systemic issues through policy reviews, identifying problems or trends, and recommending changes. And so, one of the things that I always like to state is that the good thing is that the CAP program here in Louisiana has a great working relationship with LRS compared to many other states. And so really and truly, whenever, we run across some issues that we might be hearing from clients, whenever we bring that to the attention of LRS, um, specifically to the director, she's always really good about checking into it and trying to correct whatever those issues would be. And so we're very big on paying attention to what the trends may be. Another example would be for right now, a big trend is transition, because we do realize that there are a lot of school districts that still are not wanting to allow LRS to come in and provide the transition services. So that is something that we're actually watching, and that would fall under systems advocacy. Okay, so what types of concerns can CAP help resolve? The first one is eligibility issues, denial of requested services and or services listed in the individualized plan for employment and case closure, delay in services, poor communication with VR or school staff, understanding policies and procedures. So those are going to be the concerns that CAP can help to resolve. Okay, in summary, CAP is a bridge to span differences and assist with communications between staff and consumers, a key to help consumers understand rehabilitation programs and assist staff and consumers to find options, a directory to identify resources outside the agency, and a voice to advocate for the improved services through individual or system advocacy. Now, what CAP is not a wedge to come between counselor and consumer, or between counselor and manager. And CAP is not a neutral third party in the dispute resolution process. Okay, and so basically our contact information is listed. And however, if you're going to contact us in order to get an intake done, it's very important to make sure to be prepared to provide some basic information. The first is going to be the date and names of individuals you spoke with. If there is a deadline, call as soon as possible and make sure you tell everyone you speak to what the deadline is. And that's very important because sometimes we'll get calls where the individual might have a deadline that's 2 days down the line, but they may not actually state that. That would be something very important to know because in dealing with LRS, they do have deadlines in order a lot of times to reply, and especially when you're talking about doing an appeal for a denial of a service.
So
So,
Glyn, we do have some questions.
okay.
I can see the questions that are in Zoom. I cannot see the ones in YouTube. And so I was wondering if someone from GODA could voice those. But the one I can see here asks about VR reps being assigned to schools and whether there's a list of the schools they are assigned to. Am I correct that there isn't a list, but if you contact your local VR office, they should be able to tell you who would be the correct person? Is that right?
Yes, there's going to be the VR offices. They're the counselors that are there. They're not all the counselors actually provide transition services, but they can tell you which counselors actually provide those services. And what'll happen is that you have to basically, if you're calling yourself, let's just say because you're not getting anywheres with the school, so you're contacting VR yourself to kind of get that ball rolling. Once you call and you let them know, hey, I have a transition age student, they're going to immediately know who those counselors are, and they can tell you, once it's decided which, who it is that's going to be, who's actually going to be representing that school. They can tell you who it is because um, there are some districts that are huge, and so there's more than one counselor, but they might not all have that particular school, but they'll be able to tell you which counselor actually handles that particular school.
Okay. And we have another question. And you would know this better than I. I don't know if we have the answer, if we need to get back to them on it, but is Louisiana fully and effectively using its PRE-ETS dollars, or do we leave money on the table unused?
That's, I don't think I can actually answer that question. That would probably.
I think that might be a great one to be redirected to LRS.
Yes.
And what we can do is, if Bambi, if we can get the contact information for this person, we can try and get that, connect them with someone who might be able to give them that answer.
Exactly.
Okay, and then Bambi, we can't see the questions on YouTube, but if you're able to read them to us, that'd be great.
Okay, we had a question in regards to, let's see, can only parents request someone from your office to come to IEP meetings, or can service providers contact you all for support at a meeting?
So the original contact can come from anyone, but we would need the authorization we would need to make sure that, ultimately, I'm a lawyer and Glyn works for me under my law license. So we need to know that the student, if they're over 18, or the parent wants us there, and they're the ones who would be guiding what we do. But we have had service providers reach out to us. Typically, we will give them information to provide to the family, or people can call on kind of a conference call. Sometimes parents or family members or young adults feel uncomfortable calling on their own, and we are, so long as we have authorization to talk to the other person, we're more than happy to do that if that's what the client themselves wants. So that makes sense?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Thank
Great.
you. And thank you, Debbie and Glyn. We are at the end of the time for this.
Oh, wow.
I give you some closing comments. You wanna
No, it just basically feel free to contact us if you have questions. I'm sorry we missed out on questions. I will do a quick share screen if I can, just of our contact information. So if anyone needs us, the best way to contact Glyn or I is through email if you just have questions. But if someone wants help from our agency, the best way to do that is through one of these intake numbers, through email, or through our website form. That is the quickest way to get into our intake system. Okay, and thank you all for your time. And if folks do have follow-up, please do feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you so much, Debbie and Glyn. This is great information. We really appreciate you volunteering your time and expertise to share with everyone. I want to remind everyone that we have our next session coming up at noon. It will be an incredible panel of self-advocates. It will be an 1.5-hour session, and I know you will all enjoy this panel discussion. So see you all at that time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.